Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome everyone joining us today. I would like to first introduce myself. I'm Hilary. I'm the senior researcher with Sahabat Alam Malaysia. We are one of the participating organizations in the Forest and Finance Coalition, and I'll be moderating the webinar session today. We are very pleased to have you joining us at this report launch today. Please allow me to maybe start with some housekeeping rules. I'll just share screen and start from there. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So just we'll start with some housekeeping rules. This webinar will be recorded and the recordings will be shared afterwards. I encourage everyone to mute yourself if you're not speaking to reduce some background noise. We also have quite a diverse group of participants today. We have invited the financial institutions, journalists, CSOs, as well as some international colleagues from the Forest and Finance Coalition. So we encourage all of you to put your name and organization. But if there is any need for privacy for you to stay anonymous, we will also respect your preference. This webinar aims to be a safe space for all. Participants are expected to respect one another and refrain from making comments and statements that can be considered racist, sexist, harmful, and prejudicial to any community. Participants are also prohibited from harassing and intimidating other participants in any manner whatsoever. I will walk you through some of the agenda for today. First, we will do a quick introduction to Sahabat Alam Malaysia. I know some of you are very familiar with us already, but there are a few new people. Just bear with me, I'll do a quick introduction. And then Deva, our legal advisor, and also who has been actively monitoring following the CBD COP. She will give some scene setting, and then we will have the lead author of the report to present the methodologies, key findings, and recommendations from the report. After all the presentations, there will be time for Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, or feel free to put them down in the chat box, or at the end during the Q&A section, you can also raise your hand and we will give you space to ask your questions so that we can discuss and hear different perspectives. We also welcome questions or responses from representatives from the financial sector so that we can also hear different perspectives on this matter today. Maybe just a quick introduction to Sahabat Alam Malaysia is a grassroots environmental and community-focused NGO founded in 1977. Advocates for a development model that is ecologically sustainable, socially just, and fulfills the need of majority. And we joined Forest and Finance Coalition in November 2020. Like many other local NGOs, I think by and large we have been working on environment and social issues, but by and large has been operating outside of the forest and finance or financial sector. So I think we join Forest and Finance is really we see the need for ourselves to understand what the ESG or sustainable finance, responsible investment really means for us on the ground. And we may be working from a different paradigm or perspective, I think, but we all play a different roles in advancing sustainability, sustainable development in Malaysia. Not quick one to introduce who Forest and Finance Coalition is. Forest and Finance Coalition is a coalition of 10 campaign, grassroots, and research organizations. Rainforest Action Network, Tuk Indonesia, Profundo, Amazon Watch, Reporter Brazil, and so on and so forth. And SAM is one of the coalition member. The three main pillars that the coalition works on is the first one, we maintain an open source database of financial flows to hundreds of companies involved in forest risk commodity sectors. And then we also undertake policy assessment of banks and investors' policies, ESG policies. The last one is we will coordinate analysis, research campaigns in support of the rights of communities in land and forest stewardship and seek to hold and we basically work on case studies to bridge the gap between local impacts and ESG policies. These are some of our publications on forest and finance. Feel free to check out Forest and Finance website. And these are some of our recent publications, and this is the report that we are going to launch today on regulating finance for forests and community rights in Malaysia. Okay, I will now pass it to Teva Lingam, who will give us some context and scene setting. Over to you, Teva.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Hello and welcome to our webinar today. It's really nice to see all of you. And just to set the scene today before the launch of our report, I would like to go back to the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services called IPBES, where they recently approved the Business and Biodiversity Assessment on the 9th of February 2026. And if you have actually read the summary of the report or the assessment, it actually documents in detail how corporate activities across sectors from either agribusiness to infrastructure and finance, they are the major direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So, and it also shows that regulatory frameworks, when it's well designed and enforced, they are among the most effective measures for shifting corporate behavior. And just to give you a little bit of numbers, in 2023, the global public and private finance flows with direct negative impacts on nature were estimated at $7.3 trillion. And this included environmentally harmful public subsidies and private investments in high impact sectors. And of this total, private finance accounted for around 2/3. That's about $4.9 trillion. Public spending on environmentally harmful subsidies is approximately about $2.4 trillion. Whereas only around 220 billion in public and private finance flows in 2023 were directed towards activities that actually contribute to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And there are, as you know, there are ample evidence to show that, for example, major agribusiness actors have been linked to ongoing deforestation of tropical forests, despite commitments to zero deforestation. And then there are also fossil fuel companies who have been aware for the longest time of climate and environmental impacts, but they continue to expand extraction with no real commitment to slow down or to stop. And then you will also see that there are mining and huge infrastructure projects that continue to advance in biodiversity hotspots when there are already well-documented cumulative impacts. So looking at all of this, while there is ample awareness, there's really no real commitments to halt or reverse biodiversity destruction. And these voluntary measures that we see right now, voluntary measures, reporting initiatives, and partnerships do not automatically change core business models, and they are not substitutes for robust public regulation. So the assessment itself, the business and biodiversity assessment, recognizes that voluntary approaches they are not effective in approaching or in addressing biodiversity loss and regulatory measures. and in addressing biodiversity loss. So what we need is regulatory measures such as binding standards and liability regimes and enforcement mechanisms. And these would actually consistently result in stronger biodiversity outcomes. So now is the moment. This is now a pivotal moment for us and for Malaysian financial regulators to embark on meaningful reforms in the regulation of finance. So as we have seen earlier, the business and biodiversity assessment highlighting how financial flows, particularly private finance and public subsidies, they continue to drive biodiversity loss. So it is now very important that the financial sector takes decisive action. Now, when we look at the CBD and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, this year is an important year because this is the year where there will be political decisions that will be made at COP17 in Armenia which is between 19th and 30th of October. And if you read some of the things that have actually come out from the recent meeting in Rome, we are nowhere near achieving any of the targets in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So this year, the countries will be conducting the global review of collective progress in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework through the submission of the 7th national reports. So the deadline for this submission is actually day after tomorrow. Malaysia has not submitted her report yet, but I know that we all know that NRES has been working very much on it and has done some consultation with NGOs and CSOs. So the most important thing is we ourselves must review our own national reports once it is submitted, and we must provide feedback or look at it and provide feedback. And then we also need to look at the global report on how far we have progressed as well. What came out of the recent 6th meeting of the subsidiary body of implementation in Rome is that equity is still a challenge in the implementation of the GBF. And this is where, without adequate financial support from developed countries to developing country parties, the ambitious goals and targets of the GBF will risk remaining unfulfilled, and it will just be purely aspirational. So it is not new. This has been raised at every single meeting of every time we go to the COPs, for the CBD COPs. So this is something that we really need to pay attention to, because there is biodiversity is being lost, or we are losing biodiversity every single day. And we need to do something, and we need to do something now. So I'll stop here at this moment, and I will pass it over to Guljan to take us through the report itself, so that you can see at the national level how much we are doing, or how much we are not doing, or where we are lacking at the moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Teva. If you have any questions for Teva, feel free to type them in the chat. Before I pass it on to Guljan for Guljan's presentations of the methodology, I will just give some context to the report. It is actually part of our effort to really understand the gaps and to what extent financial regulations in Malaysia are aligned with the GBF targets. And this report is modeled after the global report by Forest and Finance Coalition. We will share with you the global report as well. We adapted the methodology, and it is really to help us to provide a more constructive analysis of the gaps in the existing financial regulations, especially for those of us who are working in the field of protecting forests and community rights. For a more complete report, you may also refer to all the 3 publications that I showed. We will share that with you in the chat. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Guljan. Guljan is the lead author of our report, and she's an expert in Islamic finance. Guljan, over to you. I will share the screen now.
Thank you. Thank you, Hilary and Teva. So the context for the report has been set by Hilary and Tiva, so I'll dive straight in. The goal of this report is to encourage conversation and joint action. Basically, the big message that we want to send out is that collective action can influence the financial system. Regulators, in particular, always respond to credibility, consistency, and coordinated pressure. So from the perspective of the civil society, you could think of pressuring the financial sector as a new front in the battle for forest conservation and against deforestation, in addition to all the existing efforts, which focus mostly on government agencies here in Malaysia. And to the financial regulators, to financial institutions, this should serve as a reminder that forests are used by a broad variety of people. They are valued for different purposes beyond regulating climate, and that optimizing for carbon does not necessarily uplift all the people who are reliant on the forests. So in that sense, why finance? This is because financial institutions and markets, they fund activities that harm forests and forest communities. Finance is essentially the very system that is shaping the fate of our forests. They are the main source of the capital for the businesses that operate in forest risk sectors. And inevitably, unless there are enforceable rules in place to prevent harm, this capital ends up harming forests and forest communities. Sorry. And then why regulation? So we argue that finance is naturally high risk and is in need of strict regulation. A financial system without regulation is inherently unstable, since financial institutions, by their very nature, are designed to take high risk to maximize their short-term profit. Hence, the public should never expect concentrated private power to prioritize long-term social stability. So we argue that public accountability must be enforced. And then from the perspective of financial institutions, we believe and we argue in this report that regulation actually provides them with a predictable roadmap for long-term investment, which is something that they look for. When it comes to nature-related risks, it has been already extensively proven that they can lead to financial risks, meaning financial institutions can end up suffering losses when companies they fund do harm to the nature. And financial institutions, they hate not being able to predict the future. They actually want clear early regulations so that they can price risk accurately. So essentially, this is a key pragmatic argument that we're making in this report to financial regulators, who are Bank Negara and the Securities Commission in Malaysia, that they should be more intimately involved whenever nature-related activities are being funded. And in a way, this has been happening for a while now, but only in relation to climate regulation. Forests and forest communities, unfortunately, remain a big oversight. So this is a list of sustainability-focused regulatory documents that have been published to date by the financial regulators. As you can see, there has been quite a significant amount of activity going on sustainability. But the question is, how far do these regulations go as far as forests and communities are concerned? And I would like to point something out. All of the recent regulatory documents are supposed to be anchored to the Financial Sector Blueprint 22-26, which emphasizes resilience, sustainability, and inclusiveness in the way finance operates. The question we're asking here is that really the case as far as regulation is concerned? Is it inclusively sustainable? I think this report clearly shows that it isn't. And this is because certain sustainability issues get more attention and others, equally urgent ones, don't. Certain voices, like the industries, they get amplified, while other voices, like those from civil society, are largely ignored. Some notes on methodology. So as has been already mentioned, we are basing this on the regulations assessment framework that was developed by the Forests and Finance Coalition, which in turn is using the Global Biodiversity Framework targets as a basis. So on a broad level, we needed to see if the whole body of existing financial regulation in Malaysia for biodiversity and community rights is adequate in compliance specifically to targets 1 and 15 of the GBF, which say that financial regulations should require, which means that financial regulations should require that financial institutions do not allow financing or investing in companies involved in conversion of natural landscapes. And these regulations should also require transparency in all financing and investment flows and full disclosure of biodiversity and social impacts. So when it comes to the individual regulatory documents, we assign them a color score from red to green. Red means that the document doesn't reference any biodiversity targets at all. So basically it's silent on the issue. Orange means that the topic is mentioned, a biodiversity related topic, but only as a recommendation. Yellow means that financial institutions are required to take some steps towards the targets, but not full alignment. And green means full alignment, and that full alignment is actually required. So it has to be a policy that ensures financing and investment decisions are in full alignment with biodiversity protection. And as we'll see, most policies in Malaysia, financial policies, they fall in the middle, orange or yellow. None achieved green. So these are the guidelines, and these guidelines are some of the early financial regulatory documents on sustainability. So most of the early documents, they have been voluntary. So from BNM, we have the foundational VBIF and sectoral guides, as well as the climate change taxonomy. And from the SC, we have the sustainable and responsible investment taxonomy. So I'm going to go through each one of them briefly. First, value-based intermediation assessment framework. This was published early in 2019. It was a corporate-led initiative initiated by the Islamic banks, and the original goal was to help Islamic banks assess financing and investment decisions from an ESG perspective. And because of sort of the generality of the guidelines, now it is informally advised by the BNM to be applied across the whole of the banking sector, including conventional banks. The issue that we have with this guideline is that even as a guideline, it is too lax. And this is because its recommendations are open to interpretation based on very subjective factors, such as risk appetite and client relationships of particular banks. So in a way, I would say that VBIF is a clear case of regulatory capture that sees the industry writing its own rules, ultimately to the detriment of the public. The two sectoral guides that are relevant to our study are palm oil. The first one is palm oil. And it is from the first batch of sectoral guides published in 2021. It has a small policy section which requires banks to ensure that palm oil customers are certified, either based on the local certification schemes or the international one. So it covers most environmental and social issues related to palm oil, but but it places too much emphasis on certifications, even schemes that are known to have major flaws. So we know that these certifications have flaws, and the banks are probably aware of that too. But in the guide, they're not even advised to do their own due diligence, and that's a big problem. So if a bank only has to ask its client if they're being good and doing good instead of actually checking for themselves, the risk of environmental collapse is still effectively shifted to the public while the bank is continuing to collect interest. Then the second VBI sectoral guide that is relevant to the forests, agriculture, forestry, and fisheries is from the newer batch of sectoral guides published in 24. For the first time and the only time, it mentions timber, currently the leading cause of forest loss in the country. And as a whole, it is more substantive. There are more details on risks and more practical suggestions. But we say that it still recycles a lot of the old content and still dissuades from imposing strict measures on bad clients in favor of engaging them. Now we have climate change taxonomy, which is just a big one from the central bank. It was published in 21, and it is essentially a classification system for financial institutions, primarily banks, to categorize their clients' businesses based on climate change impact. So the document states that climate change is meant to include broader environmental risks. And it is, so earlier I mentioned, I put it under the guidelines section, but it actually has a mandatory part as well. It is mandatory only when it comes to disclosure. It requires biannual submissions on climate exposures. So the main issue that we have with this taxonomy is that it is principles-based, which means that there are no quantitative measures or industry-specific recommendations. And then there is a similar taxonomy that was released by the Securities Commission for the Malaysian capital market, SRI taxonomy. So it is a classification system for economic activities for investors. In a way, it is broader than Bank Negara's taxonomy. It is not so hyper-focused on climate change, but covers environmental and social issues more generally. But again, it is principles-based, so it is not specific or mandatory. Finally, we get to the policies. So financial regulators have been gradually moving towards enforcement, but on the climate front solely. So from BNM, there is climate risk management and scenario analysis, and then related to it, climate risk stress testing exercise. And then from the SC, there is the latest National Sustainability Reporting Framework. First, climate risk management and scenario analysis. This is the main financial regulation related to climate and broader environmental risks. It came into effect at the end of 24, and it requires banks to include climate considerations into governance, risk management, stress testing, and disclosure. We have to give credit where it's due. It is a big step forward for the Malaysian financial regulators, but biodiversity and human rights considerations still lack deliberate coverage. So, for example, this risk management policy, it promotes these 3 lines of defense. So when it comes to climate risks, they are supposed to be assessed in successive stages. First, during credit application and review, client onboarding, ongoing monitoring, and product approval. Secondly, there is also a role for the independent risk management and compliance function. And thirdly, there is the review by the internal audit team. We say that despite this looking very comprehensive, non-compliant customers are still, they still remain eligible for financing. And this is because even in this document, in this policy, financial institutions are reminded to take a nurturing approach towards businesses with problems, even when they may violate national forest-related laws and policies such as mandatory palm oil certification and conditions imposed by the Department of Environment. The other complement policy, climate risk stress testing exercise, it requires banks to project their performance under different climate scenarios. They have to assess the 10 largest customers in 8 economic sectors, which include agriculture, forestry, and fishing. And that includes a subsector of oil palm. So just like in the main policy, climate forest-related risks are covered, but only indirectly and not comprehensively. Finally, the last policy, the latest one published by the financial regulators by the SC, National Sustainability Reporting Framework. So it is actually the first mandated policy by the SC, and it mandates sustainability and climate disclosure for large companies, including financial institutions, based on the international financial reporting standards. And Scope 3 disclosure, which is something that is very relevant to the financial sector and the topic in discussion, they're going to become mandatory from 2027. So the National Sustainability Reporting Framework, it does cover nature-related requirements, but they're limited to carbon accounting, which does not capture broader biodiversity and community impacts. So in that sense, this NSRF is a mirror of BNM's climate-related policing in recent years. So it suffers from the exactly same issues. Although right now financial authorities globally, not just in Malaysia, they appear to be putting some effort into incorporating nature-related financial disclosures into existing climate standards. And so far, their favored framework is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD. These IFRS sustainability standards are going in the same direction, and BNM too, in fact, it has been developing its own TNFD-aligned pilot. But we say that TNFD is a deeply flawed framework to begin with. It focuses on risks to companies rather than impacts from companies, and it lacks real transparency. It leaves out such high impact measures as supplier and grievance lists. So anything based on it will be of very limited value. So although there are very obvious benefits of aligning to international standards, like what this policy is doing, we argue that Malaysia should not be misled by compromised systems, but instead be guided by local needs and concerns. Plus, there are very viable alternatives to TNFD2. Which, this brings me to the conclusion. So the findings of this report is that not the bottom line is that not a single regulation achieved a green status. And this is because none requires full alignment with biodiversity targets. Most of the regulatory documents, they scored orange, which means that they mention relevant topics, but only as recommendations, or yellow, meaning they require some steps in the direction of forest protection, biodiversity protection, but there is no comprehensive action. So what does it mean in practice? It means that current regulations, financial regulations, they emphasize the importance of preserving natural landscapes. They encourage financial institutions to be mindful of the environment and the social risks. But, and this is critical, they don't actually preclude any harmful activities. So what happens on the ground is that a bank can still finance deforestation, can still finance plantation expansion on peatlands or projects that violate indigenous land rights, as long as they follow certain procedural steps, as long as they get their clients to commit to eventual improvements. And this is why we say that the regulations focus on risk management and transparency, but they don't draw clear red lines as to what cannot be financed. Which brings me to my recommendations. The main one is that there should be a timeline for transition. So the experience of the past decades has shown that voluntary approaches have been tried, but they're not working. So we say that we need mandatory rules with real enforcement. And deforestation has to be upgraded from a matter that is handled through a principle-based approach to one requiring rules-based standards, which already apply to climate change issues. And what this report repeatedly emphasizes is that there has to be a clear timeline for transitioning to binding rules for the protection of forests and community rights. Sorry. Recommendation number two is that forests have to be taken as a priority. So we say that when it comes to forests and forest communities, this issue has to be taken with a sense of urgency. Regulations for forests should be holistic. They have to take biodiversity and community rights as goals beyond just focusing on trees as carbon stores. And just as regulatory treatment of climate change has shifted gradually from basic frameworks to more granular tool, we believe that the treatment of nature can also, undertake the same sort of journey. But the transition has to be clear, and it has to happen sooner than later. And once adequate regulation is in place, proper enforcement through explicit and consistent non-compliance penalties is prerequisite. Number 3, transparency and remedy. So the status quo is that banks and investors are not required to disclose company names and project details, and their reporting on social and biodiversity impacts is very high level and usually not actionable. So regulators must institute complaint reporting on biodiversity and community rights, as well as on-the-ground checks when necessary to make sure that whatever certifications their clients present them with, they're actually, they are valid and nothing is slipping under their gaze. We believe that Malaysia has to shift from voluntary TNFD style reporting to enforceable and impact-first standards that lock in community participation in rulemaking, verifiable transparency, and legal consequences for nature-related harms. Speaking of community participation, that brings me to the final recommendation, civil society participation. So far, even though the Malaysian regulators claim to be stakeholder-oriented, the CSOs who represent local communities, who are a key stakeholder in matters of sustainability, these CSOs have been largely absent in policy-making processes. Instead, policy development has been dominated by industry players who appear to volunteer to be regulated. And this sort of gives an appearance of change and is actually a common strategy that is used by the industry to preempt more rigorous controls in response to public demands. Only more conspicuous international big NGOs end up being involved, like WWF in the Joint Committee for Climate Change, JC3, while smaller community indigenous organizations with specialized knowledge are largely excluded. Another issue that we see is that existing public consultation processes that regulators claim to have, they lack structured mechanisms for grassroots participation. So what we hope to see is that civil society will be actively consulted from now on. In the near future, that includes updating the climate change taxonomy. And in the longer term, maybe even the development of a standalone enforceable regulation on nature. This is my concluding slide, and I would like to leave with a message to the different audiences that are present in this call. So to financial institutions, I would say that voluntary commitments aren't enough. On top of committing to NDPE, on top of respecting FPIC, establishing grievance mechanisms, and being transparent about your clients, you need to tell the regulators that industry-wide rules need to be mandated for stability and fairness. And to regulators, the message is that you must set binding rules with clear timelines and enforcement to move from recommendations to requirements, from guidelines to mandates, include civil society in policy development, and establish penalties for non-compliance. And to civil society organizations, I would like to say that without organized, broad, sustained public pressure, we stand no chance at changing the macro picture, i.e. the power's continued treatment of forests as one giant cash crop with make-believe certification schemes. We need direct actions to amplify the voices of the frontline communities, to stand in solidarity with their local resistance. But also, we need to educate the masses to, to make the masses understand how floods that keep inundating their homes, how rising daily temperatures and extreme heat waves, erratic rainfall patterns, how they're all connected to forest felling. And finally, to journalists who are present, I say, please continue investigating and reporting on financial flows to destructive projects. Follow the money, hold institutions accountable when they claim to be sustainable, but continue financing harm. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Gujan. So we will now move to Q&A. But before that, I will just reiterate that what Gujan said at the beginning, that this report is just a beginning, a starting point for us to stimulate discussion. So perhaps if you have any questions, I'm checking the chat now. You may raise your hand and please identify yourself. Anyone has any question? If I may see a show of hand. Okay. If not, I have a question, and we can have some interactive poll questions towards the end. Perhaps just for Gujan, I think. Sorry, can I have Gujan and Deva back on the screen with me? Thank you. Okay. I think one thing that perhaps to hear from you, how would you respond to the perspective of government or regulators who support adopting a principle-based approach, which according to them, this takes into account the country's stage of economic development, and also maybe recognizes that businesses and other economic sectors are still in the early stage of managing climate and nature-related risks, who argue that a more nurturing approach is required. Perhaps just to hear your perspective, or how would you respond to that? And then after that, we'll conclude with a poll. Thank you.
So I think one thing that I would like to highlight here is that the financial regulators, particularly the central bank, when they put forward this argument that some issues need to be handled through a principles-based approach and others through a rules-based approach, they never actually justified why some issues are more urgent than the others. From the macro picture, you can see why there is a lot of focus on climate change, given Malaysia's net zero commitments and the global climate change being in the limelight. But especially when it comes to tropical countries like Malaysia, Malaysia has rainforests that are some of the most biodiverse on the planet. It is natural for us to expect that Malaysia takes rainforests as a priority, forests as a priority, and all the communities that call forests their home. So in that sense, there is a bit of ambiguity. There is no clarity as to why certain issues are being prioritized and why others are being relegated to being handled at a later stage. And then the other issue that I have with this argument is that it shows that the regulator is placing a lot of trust in the industry And that is not corroborated by the evidence that we have in our hands. So the Banking on Biodiversity Collapse, the Malaysian version, clearly showed that local financial institutions, they continue financing deforestation, they continue financing social harms, despite on paper committing to voluntary standards. So we say, although it makes sense when you take into account the economic development, but sustainability is a broad theme for Malaysia. It doesn't just stop at climate change. It has to go further and cover the whole of nature comprehensively. And that's in addition to some of the points that I made during the presentation, where I talked about voluntary standards creating an unequal playing field for the financial players, for financial institutions, since some of them are pressured, the bigger ones, to adopt more stringent standards, and then the smaller ones are going to just be satisfied with the bare minimum. And that creates a race to the bottom, essentially, because it gives an incentive to the businesses to shop around for whichever banks has the weakest and the weaker standards, and that bank is going to get the business.
Thank you, Gujan, for your response. I'm mindful of the time. We have 3 minutes to 5. Perhaps we will just end this before we end the webinar. Maybe a quick interactive poll. We have prepared. Let me share you the screen. It's on Slido. Please, there is one question that there's there. Please, we have shared the link to join Slido, and you can also join slido.com, sorry, and use the code here. So after hearing the entire session or presentation, I think one of the questions that we would like to hear from you before we let you go is really, how urgent do you think is the need to transition for Malaysia to transition from principle-based approach to rule-based standards? That means to regulate finance to make it mandatory, from voluntary to mandatory, for the protection of forest and community rights in Malaysia. Yeah, and then I can see that there are some views that within the next 2 to 5 years, we should transition. Any other answers, any other opinions? If anyone wants to jump in to share your views, I see we have 4 votes now. Kindly please help us understand your views, and if anyone want to share why you pick 2 to 5 years, please. Or if you think, okay, I will proceed to the next one. If anyone, is anyone still on this and still thinking what should be put here? We have prepared 3 questions actually, but I am mindful of the time. If okay, then I will just move it on to the second question. But if anyone want to engage further after this webinar, we are very much welcome, because this is just part of our initial effort to help us understand the current gaps in the financial regulation and how for civil society to engage with the regulators and financial sector. The second question we have here, is what are the challenges you foresee in transitioning to rule-based standards around protection of forests and community rights in Malaysia? If anyone is typing. Okay, I am mindful of the time. Okay, profit-based interest. Thank you for your answer. Perhaps I will, whoever want to provide your feedback, I will, client confidentiality, thank you so much. I think that is one of our key lack of awareness, I think. Lack of public attention, understanding. Thank you for that. I'll quickly move to the next one. What else is missing from the report? I know that you haven't really reviewed the report. If anything that you spotted or missing, feel free to let us know. It is also fine that you think you need to review the report first and then only tell us what you think is missing. And that will come in our next engagement. Okay, I will stop the screen sharing now. And thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate all of your participation. I think this is just a starting point for us. I think I wouldn't say this report is perfect for now, but this is our first attempt with Gujan's help to bring together some constructive analysis, hopefully. And we will continue to use this report in our engagement with the regulators. If you would like to, we will share the reports with you in our email later and also the recordings. Feel free to reach out again if you have any recommendations, feedback to the report. Thank you once again. Thank you so much.